Okay, in terms of the stuff, the deadlines remain unchangified. So, quizzes part 1, September 21st, end of day. Exam 1, quizzes part 2, October 19th. Exam 2, quizzes part 3, November 16th. Exam 3, exam 4, quizzes part 4, December 7th, the day that you'll learn infamy. And exam 5, your final, if you need that. Deadlines December 14th at noon. And then for the paper, draft deadline November 9th, plus 5 November 14th. Emergency deadline November 21st. And desperation deadline December 7th, the day that you'll live in infamy. Before pressing on to new stuff, anything about the stuff that has been, or the stuff that shall be, that needs more stuff?
Yes. Could you speak about the paper, what we're gonna do, where we're gonna begin the, what the topics are gonna be on and whatever?
Yep, we will spend, next week we'll cover the paper, but if you want to get a head start on it, there's, in the video section, there's a video on the paper. There's all, because it'll be one of the, because I recorded last year as well, it'll say like in the course thing, like video for it. There's also the paper guide in PDF format, which is written out there, and the PowerPoint boards.
I've not been able to reach your PowerPoints, only the book.
Really, should be in the documents in there. I'll check on it.
Yes, in
What's in there?
there.
You've already said it, like, just kind of, sometimes when you load, depending on your web browser and how it's loading, sometimes it won't load like everything. I've had that happen, or it just like leaves out like half the page. Because of the demons of Blackboard trying to stop you. Okay, so last time we're looking at arguments, which are the brains of philosophy, and we were looking at one example of the inductive argument of the type analogical argument, which involves comparing things. Now, not surprisingly, since metaphysics is about, strange stuff typically beyond what we observe, analogies are often a good way to make arguments. Now, normally when people make analogies, they typically do so in an informal manner, mainly because, only academics talk like this. But the strict form of argument by analogy is this. As we saw, we make an argument by analogy. You're saying that two things, because they're alike in certain ways, they're alike in this other way you're concerned with. So to be formal about it, two things are being compared. Thing X, thing Y. And the first thing you establish is that X has certain qualities. Now X and Y you could be comparing, say like space to a sheet of paper, or comparing Platonic forms to Cheetos, literally. So X and Y could be any two things you're comparing. Now the first thing you establish is that X has certain qualities. And just, because you have to put something here, we're saying that it's got qualities P, Q, and R. Now P, Q, and R can be any properties. It doesn't have to be just 3, it could be any number. It's just something's got to go there, so why not? Premise 2, Y has properties P, Q, and R. So basically what you're saying in premise 1 and 2 is X and Y have properties in common. Premise 3, you establish that X has property Z, the property you're concerned with. Then you conclude that Y has that as well. So kind of informally, X and Y are alike. X has Z, Y has Z. We have a concrete example outside of metaphysics. Now, I'll use a moral example. One moral concern today about technology is with drones, things that fly around, whether they can crawl or swim, etc., typically fly. And so one concern morally is about privacy. Now, one way to argue morally, using argument by analogy, is take something your audience already agrees is good or bad, and show how what you're talking about is like the good or bad thing. So let's try to find something. Suppose you want to argue that using drones to spy on people is bad. Well, let's find something bad that's simple. And here's an easy way to do it. Would it be okay or bad, morally, for someone to prop a ladder against the side of your house or dorm or apartment and peer at you while you're taking a shower? Good or bad? that. Now, in the case, so we've established, that, looking at, doing that would be, we were wrong. Wrong is our Z. And the qualities that argument persons like, intruding where you have an expectation of privacy, using a ladder, using like a device. Now, in the case of the drone, we could argue that it's similar, because although they're not there in person, the drone effectively works like a ladder. It allows them to get someplace they wouldn't be able to get to normally and look at stuff. So you could argue that since, using a ladder to get up and peer into someone's shower is wrong, then using a drone would be wrong as well, by analogy. Now, analogies are also used, outside of philosophy and ethics. They're used in law. If anyone's considering a career in law, the argument by precedent essentially is an argument by analogy. It just being, if say, well, let's take a case like this. Suppose someone has flown their drone into someone's property and you're their defense attorney and they're accused of like trespassing. So what you try to do is find cases like yours where the defendant was found innocent. And you'd argue, for the jury and judge, in so-and-so, in this case, in this case, in this case, based on the law, the person was found innocent, therefore my client should be found innocent. And of course, the prosecutor is doing the opposite. They're going and looking at cases where it went in the favor of the prosecution. And in many ways, a lot of law is kind of a battle over analogies. Who's got the better precedent? And law, of course, involves mostly a lot of reading. I mean, the law shows are cool. It's kind of weird. It's like they make all these cool shows about lawyers. But lawyering is like super not, it's exciting if you're a lawyer, but it's no more accurate than if you had like a show about philosophy professors who are out getting in gunfights and high-speed chases. No more than 4 or 5 gunfights per year, actually, not every week. Mostly with people on history. You know those people on history. No, they're friends of mine. So, also a final non-philosophical example, medical reasoning. When doctors do a diagnosis, a lot of it is argued by analogy. So, suppose you go to medical school, become a doctor, and you learn about, something like, say, poison ivy, outbreak, and the patient comes in, they say they get itching on their legs, and they are out, walking around like in their yard, and you look and they got a rash, and you'd say, well, poison ivy is these, the patient I saw in medical school has these qualities, this person is similar, that person had poison ivy, this person has poison ivy as well. And so you conclude by analogy, poison ivy. Now the method is inductive, which means that all this could be true, but your conclusion could be wrong, which is, which helps explain when they misdiagnose people. The doctor could be doing everything correctly and still get the diagnosis wrong. Have you ever been on WebMD? I mean, the end result of WebMD is always, you're dying. You're totally dead, which is why I don't go there, because everything leads to, if they had a flow chart for WebMD, it would always be like death, cancer, death. But so many things have similar, symptoms. If you've got like, if you're sore, you have a fever, you feel kind of tired and worn down, could be just, you're just tired. You get a cold, you get the flu, you get anthrax, you get Lyme disease, you could become a werewolf. There's all kinds of options. Well, the werewolf one's kind of easy. See if silver burns you, then you're becoming a werewolf. Or a vampire. Now, how do we use this in metaphysics? Well, typically what we try to do is, if we're arguing for like, weird stuff, we would try to like make it analogous to stuff that maybe is like less weird that people already accept. For example, one of the, and we'll talk more about like papers later, but basically the paper is a case paper, which means like you pick a topic, and you can pick anything in metaphysics, and you argue for your position. And one of the potential topics, and again, you can pick any topic you wish or make up your own if you don't like the ones available, is love across the possible worlds. So one kind of interesting metaphysical and practical question is, what is it about, the other person that one loves? Who is it that one loves? Is it their qualities? Is it their essence or their soul, etc.? And of course, in one of the weird cases, you're asked to imagine a scenario where there's a married couple doing research at a company that is creating dimensional portals. Have you ever seen like Sliders or Rick and Morty, Adventures of, that type of thing? Opens up. And so imagine you've got Dick and Jane, the scientist, and they test out a portal. Dick jumps through it, and boom, Dick doesn't make it. He's dead. And Jane is distraught. So what she does is she has a portal that can open up into any possible world. So she finds a world where Jane died, but Dick didn't die. And so he hops through the portal and says, oh, it worked. He gives him a big hug.
So basically like that episode of Rick and Morty when Rick destroys their world, and then
You find a new one. Yeah, once your world is gone, you find a new family, you find your family. And so kind of the metaphysical question it would be, is that really your family? Or in the case of the Rick and Morty episode. And of course, Morty's gonna answer. He's like, it doesn't matter. Now, so the question there would be is, should that Jane, is she really in love with that, with that guy? And one way you could argue is by, analogy. One analogy might be, well, we don't do a lot of dimensional traveling most of the time, but there are twins. So effectively, he's like an identical twin. And so if someone loves somebody, does that mean they could just replace them with their identical twin and everything would be the same? And by analogy, you might argue that, yes, if they are the same in all ways, then it wouldn't matter. And of course, there are movies where, usually more innocuous, where like the identical twins swap themselves out. And it doesn't matter because there is no, you could argue there is no difference. But then of course, there are movies also where they do swap out and it does make a difference. And so one way you could argue about kind of that weird scenario of like dimensional, the other dimensions, is use something less weird like, well, twins, because we really do have twins. So analogies are pretty useful in metaphysics because we're usually dealing with like weird stuff. Or so for example, suppose you're trying to explain the Platonic heaven. As we'll see, Plato claims that there are forms, they're not here, they're outside of space and time. And so one question is, well, how could you, convince people there's such a thing? And one way you can do it is draw an analogy with religion. Because heaven is not supposed to be, the Christian heaven is not supposed to be here, but it's supposed to be real. So the way you'll see this in action, the way I usually explain the Platonic heaven to people is using what they're more familiar with, which is the standard, non-Platonic heaven. Because it's more familiar. Even people who aren't religious, they're like, oh yeah, heaven, heard of that. If they're not religious, they don't get to go. That's the rules, I don't make them. I don't know who gets to go to heaven, not up to me. Not my job. Someone else's job. Now, how do you tell when you get a good analogy or a bad one? Well, fortunately, there are three straightforward standards. One is how much the two things have in common. The more, the better. But of course, if you take any two things in the universe, there's a good chance they'll have a whole bunch of stuff in common. For example, if we're making an argument by analogy, like, I have various properties. I have size, shape, density, volume. I'm in this room. I contain some hydrocarbons, and therefore, I'm a philosophy professor. This folder has shape, size, density, mass, and volume. It's in this room, and it's been on campus a long time, and it's also got some hydrocarbons in it as well, just like me. We're like hydrocarbon twins. Therefore, this is a philosophy professor. Now, it is an argument by analogy, because I have drawn a comparison, and there are a lot of things in common. We have a whole bunch of me in this folder. We go way back. We have a lot in common. But would it be a good inference to say this is therefore a professor? No, because those qualities, aren't relevant. You want to look at qualities that are relevant to, in this case, being a professor. So the second question is, after how much they have in common, is how relevant or how important are those qualities. And so in this case, we haven't got a lot of relevant to being a professor. I mean, there are some. I mean, this folder's been on campus, quite a bit, which is something professors hopefully do to earn their money. But that's about it. So, doesn't have a lot of relevant, shared properties. Lastly, would be, are there any relevant dissimilarities that break the comparison? And basically, these three boil down to, you can put them as like the standard, like the more alike in more ways, the better. Or even simpler, the more alike the better, the less alike the worse. Now you may wonder, like, why consider relevant dissimilarities? Why not just, if you're arguing, for something, why say there, bring up any differences at all? Well, one reason is, because the goal of philosophy is truth. So you'd want to consider, be honest about things. Consider things that may be defective with your argument. And one thing you'll see, it can be kind of weird to read, people who are familiar with philosophy. Good philosophers, any bad ones, always bring objections against their own views. And that can be kind of confusing. Some of my friends, they'll like read what I write and say, first, don't read that stuff. Just don't do that. And they'll say, like, what is your actual, you bring up all these objections, and it's really weird because most people, when they write something, they just give their side and don't even consider the opposing view except to maybe like just attack it. And when doing, philosophy kind of properly, at least, my view, most philosophers' view, you bring up objections, like what could be wrong with your view, what's good about the other view, which is often seen as pretty weird, especially people who are more familiar with politics, where you never say good things about anybody else. Now, so one reason to bring up again is truth. The other reason is it can also be pragmatic, because if you show you're bringing up opposition to your view, it can have some persuasive value. Because people can, if they're rational people, they'll say, oh, they're considering opposing viewpoints, so they're more likely, if they're rational, more likely to listen, because you're not closing them up. And sometimes it actually works. I found that sometimes when people read my stuff, like I do around political philosophy, they'll say, well, I used to hate everything you said, but then I saw you occasionally talk about things I like, so you're not that terrible. I was like, thank you for saying I'm not that terrible. Not Clinton, I think they said I was not Hillary Clinton terrible. I was like, thanks, I guess. That's true, I've never murdered a hobo, so that's true. I'm sorry, that's a rumor. That and she's a lizard person, those are just rumors. Also not a lizard person, warm-blooded. Own skin, not fit. Gotta clear that stuff up these days. And there's, good medical record stuff, but we prove that, hopefully. Unless my doctor's in on it too, Dr. Sleestack there. So, so one reason is if sometimes you can be persuasive to people. They'll say, well, they're considering, possible objections. Another pragmatic reason is this. I'll draw a metaphor or analogy to scandals. Often political scandals, scandals for celebrities, it's often not the scandal that causes them the most problem. It's often what? Yeah, the way they respond to it. They like try to cover, they deny it, they try to cover it up, and then it comes out, so they're doubly bad, because they have a tape of them saying, denying everything, and then everything is true, so it looks bad. Now, when there are potential problems, like dissimilarities, if you bring them up in a controlled way, which is why people who are experts at, crisis management, they first tell people don't do that stuff. But then if people are going to do it anyways, then they find a way, to get ahead of the story. So you would want to bring up relevant dissimilarities. Again, it's about truth, but also a pragmatic standpoint, because the reader, if they're competent as well, they're probably thinking of those problems. And if you brought them up, they'll say, oh, they brought them up, problem solved. But if you didn't bring them up, they're like, aha, this shows they're wrong. Also, finally, if you ever have,
You said you didn't bring the problems up to show that they were wrong.
yeah, because a person might say, if you bring up the problem and respond to it, the person's reading, they're like, oh, they've responded to it. But if if it's something they're likely to think of, and you don't bring it up, they'll think, oh, here's a problem they didn't respond to, therefore they're wrong. No, I mean, they don't always do that, but the more that's why, from a pragmatic standpoint, philosophers typically do bring up objections, because that way another philosopher reading them doesn't say, ooh, they missed this obvious problem. They say, oh, I guess they covered that. Now, you can't cover everything, but it's useful to do. And of course, finally, from a pragmatic standpoint, if you gotta hit like a word count, this is considering problems and applying to them very useful. One thing I learned in grad school, like you have to write like a 20-page paper, is if you're at like 10 pages, you're like, I've got, what more do I say? Bring up an objection, reply to it. A few more pages, bring up another objection, reply to it. It's a word generator. So if you're ever stuck in writing an argumentative essay, that's the way to do it. Consider an objection, reply to it. I mean, it's still doing legitimate work, but it's a way to generate more words. And there's always objections, because there's no position that is so obviously true that it can't be objected against. Now, another argument, which is very useful in metaphysics, again, because we're usually doing like, weird stuff, and when you're in metaphysics as opposed to physics, you don't have like any budget, so you don't have cool like, hadron colliders or even like microscopes. You just got thought experiments. So one effective way to argue is what's called an appeal to intuition. Now, an intuition is what? If you get one, should you be worried?
It's a thought, a feeling.
Yeah, kind of a thought or feeling before you've really thought it through. So intuition is kind of how we feel about something before we really put a lot of thought into it. Now, the appeal to intuition is kind of a smushing of persuasion and argumentation. Because on the persuasive side, what you're trying to do is make the audience feel a certain way so that they believe a certain way, which is the goal of persuasion. But you're also trying to argue, because you're not just trying to make them feel to believe something untrue, or it doesn't matter, you're trying to also give them reasons to accept something as true. Now, the appeal to intuition can range from like just pure non-argument at all, technically speaking, to actually a full argument. Now, one problem with intuitions, of course, is that, well, both a good and a bad thing. If someone already shares your intuitions, they probably will believe what you said. You don't have to do much to convince them. So, for example, someone who, we can take as an example the hearings about Kavanaugh for the Supreme Court. If somebody already, feels a certain way about the values that Kavanaugh has positively, and they intuitively think what he thinks is right, they're not going to have any real objections against him. And someone who intuitively is opposed to what his values are, they're going to intuitively be opposed. And so that's kind of the problem there is, if someone doesn't have your intuitions, an appeal to intuition by itself is not going to do much. If you say intuitively blah, 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 they're going to say, I'm not feeling that. I don't feel that at all. It's not going to work. From the standpoint of persuasion, you've got to think about what sort of intuitions does your audience have? How do you make them feel the way you want them to feel? Now, the easiest way to do it, which is one I do when to be honest, when I really can't think of an argument, so it's kind of cheating, is just to say intuitively, comma, and then put in whatever you're saying. And it technically, in a way, is an argument, because you did say premise, I've said intuitively, conclusion, this is true. But of course, it's not super powerful. Now, you can use that, though. It is a legitimate move when, in fact, it does match people's intuitions. It's basically an appeal to plausibility. Because, take for example in ethics. If someone says intuitively throwing nuns and kittens into a wood chipper is wrong, that's going to match most people's intuitions. And if it doesn't, there's something wrong with that person. It's kind of like the test in Blade Runner, okay, there's something, like, how do you feel about nuns and wood chippers and kittens? You're like, they're a great combination that goes great together. I'm like, okay, time to leave the room.
You said go right in the oven.
Yeah. Now, so the weakest method is intuitively common. And you can also use this obviously in metaphysics. You can say, like, intuitively, this is crazy, which is fair, because a lot of metaphysics is crazy. Now, the improved method to make it more effective and also more argumenty is the story method. Because Daniel Dennett, this guy, Daniel Dennett, he's like dead now, but before he died, he was interesting to read, which is rare in a philosopher, because he liked to tell stories, and he called them intuition poems. And the idea would be is that he would present a story, a scenario, and the idea would be is that by going through the scenario, it would appeal to your intuitions, and you'd say at the end of the story, yeah, that seems like a plausible story. And as you might imagine, it's commonly used in shows that are explicitly trying to be philosophical, like Twilight Zone, Black Mirror, Legion, and they tell a story, and you can tell they're trying to get to a philosophical point to make it seem appealing. Now, a good example would be, well, episodes of Black Mirror. If you have Netflix, if you like kind of like sci-fi, horror, highly recommend them. Not every episode is like great, but they're all at least good. What is saying a lot for the show. But some are kind of creepy. So one way you can do appeal to intuition is like they do in that show. So, for example, to make it seem plausible that a human can be copied, they'll create a scenario where that is occurring. And you go through the story, and they make it seem, you go through the steps, and you're like, yes, this could happen. Here are the steps. This is how this could happen. We could have a machine that is actually like a person that is talking and potentially feeling. Also, in epistemology, shows like Legion, the movie The Matrix, did a really good job motivating people's intuitions. Like before, when I used to try to teach epistemology, people would go, how do you know everything is really real for real? And people would be like, I know it's real because I'm hungry for some lunch. But then when The Matrix came out, you just go, The Matrix, and people are like, yeah. And similarly, like with shows now, like with Legion and Black Mirror, you can Legion does a great example. It's basically an epistemology show in a way, because kind of their big themes is how do you know what's actually real? And when you watch an episode, they're so weird and freaky. You're like, hey, I have no. When you're done with the episode, I have no idea. It could all be unreal. And so they're essentially an argument by, intuition, telling a story, trying to make it seem real. So if you're writing about, say, the metaphysics of personal identity, but could a virtual being be a person? You could create a story in which the virtual being is a person, make it seem plausible. Now, of course, the story is still, in a way, more persuasion. It's more about after you see the show or read the story, that you kind of feel that this could happen. But to make it a full argument, you would need to take a step beyond just the story and then put in the reasons why the story, in addition to motivating, actually proves the argument behind the story. For example, if you could create if you want to argue that, say, a machine could be a person, you could.
You said it's like a full argument. What was the rest of that you said?
If you want to make a full argument, in addition to the story, you would need to provide reasons as to why the story should prove. So in a way, what you're trying to do is you're trying to
Prove your plot.
Yeah, basically prove your plot. Say why, here's my story, so hopefully the audience is feeling the way you want them to feel, and then you use the argument to show why they should think the way they should think to prove your point. So, for example, if you were trying to argue that a robotic animal should be treated with the same moral status as a real animal, what you can do is, if you are good at writing like, fiction, you could write a story about, Ruffy, the artificial dog, and how, and, if you want to make people really feel, you can have like, can be kind of like an old yellow story. Ruffy gets the computer virus and they're gonna put him down. Also copyright. Yeah, and so you tell a story, and the idea of making people feel that there's a story that an excerpt is called I think it's the Soul of the Mark III Beast, and in the story this person is making like little machines, and the person that he kind of does an appeal to intuition within the story itself, because there's a person who says, oh, they can feel, so he hands the person a hammer and says, destroy it. And so he goes to swing at it, and of course it squeaks, the little machine squeaks and runs away, and then he corners it, and it's like squeaking and shaking, and he's like, then he hits it with a hammer, it squeals and flips over, and, it's leaking hydraulic fluid, and he's like hammering it, and of course he feels terrible, because he feels like he's killing a real creature. So you can write a story about like that, so the person at the end would feel that, yeah, there could be a machine that is like an animal. Now, of course, you need to argue, because you're writing a story, because one thing about, it's kind of like to go back to when I was a kid and how I ruined fun. I remember someone saying, like, who do you think would win in the fight between Hulk and Superman? And even then, I was a troublesome philosopher, because I said, well, depends on who's writing it. DC is writing it, Superman. Marvel's writing it, the Hulk. It's all, you write. It's not like you actually have a mechanism for that. You just write what happens. And so if you're building a story, the story goes the way you want it to go. You're in full control. So what you'd have to do is give the audience some reason to think beyond what's just called fiat, just saying it so why they should accept it. And so in this case, you bring in an argument, that's not an appeal to intuition to bolster that appeal, to show why the intuitions would be correct. So, for example, what you might do is argue, well, consider this. In the case of humans, how do we know that they feel? Why don't we just go and whack people with hammers? Well, because they make noises and leak stuff when you hit them, and it makes us feel bad. So with a machine, we don't know for sure if the machine really, really could be, like an animal, but we don't know about people. We don't know if they really feel. We don't know if they really suffer. They may squeak and make noises and stuff, but we don't know what's going on. Same with the machine. So we have as much reason to believe that the machine, if it has all that complex behavior, we have as much reason to believe it's an animal or a person as we do for other people, because all we have to go on is their behavior. And so if we think that other people feel under people because they squeak when we hit them with a hammer, the same would apply to machines, which would be, an argument.
Do we do a cut and dry analysis like that? So if humans think, feel, have consciousness, have, let's just say variables that make up what they are, do we then say, well, if this being or creature also has those same characteristics, it can be considered a human and treated as such?
Yeah, you can do that.
No, so is that what we do actively in philosophy right now?
Yeah, because you'd want to, because the appeal to intuition tends to be more interesting to read, fun to read, but then to make the full argument, you'd want to have that, like you said, that cut and dry stuff in there. It kind of kills the fun, but not necessarily. Yeah, it does.
So the reason I ask is just because I keep thinking about, like, you keep bringing up these examples where it involves us, the individual having to deal with like if this is like something that you can destroy, right? A lot of those cases, like if you have a twin or something like that, can you just replace the twin because they have the same characteristics? I feel like there are so many variables that come in within those that you can't just wholesale, just cut and dry, just because there's similarities. Like it has to be like a fundamental, like tied down thing that's associated to each particular thing that makes it a something, right? So human beings have to have set particulars about them that can't just be like nitpick that and say that, all right, this is a human being, but also this is a human being. right? And so, I mean, maybe like I confused myself.
No, you're right, you could make that argument, because because the positions I'm giving are possible positions, but you can make the case you make as well. You could say, well, you could argue we don't have a definitive account of what it is to be human, so we couldn't say if they're the same person or not, because we don't even know what that is.
But do we have a definitive account of what it means to be human?
No.
Okay, and that's why.
No, yeah, sure, because like, especially if you bring in, well, human, we kind of have like a DNA definition, like we know we can recognize like human DNA, but even then there's some variation. For example, if you have any European ancestry at all, you've got some non-Homo sapiens DNA in there, picked up from Neanderthals and so multiple species. Which is kind of weird, because if you have, like I said, Europeans interbred with Neanderthals, etc., and so there's all kinds of, man, who knows what else is in there too?
Yeah.
All kinds of other DNA. Yeah, so we don't even have a strict absolute definition of human, because there are slight variations in everybody's DNA, so you really can't, you can have like, if you fall within kind of this range, you know, if you have this, you're human and not like a banana. But when it comes to like, you know, like for example, were Neanderthals, were they human? And you'd say, well, genetically slightly different, because human is also not only like a biological term, but also kind of a normative term, like being human as opposed to biologically Homo sapiens. Because some people might say that you could have humans that are different species, but still part of the part of humanity, part of humans. And then if you bring in person, then it becomes even more complicated, because you could have persons that aren't humans at all. They could be, you know, maybe they're intelligent like dinosaurs at one point, but they wouldn't be human, they'd be people. Yeah, so you're right. There's all, I mean, in the arguments I give, I do present, kind of like exact premises, but I'm not going to claim that those are the definitive answer. And as you point out, there's many other positions you could take. Yeah, good, excellent point.
I just have a quick question. Are Europeans the only area that's attributable to where you were like Neanderthals, and people of European ancestry, like that DNA is mixed? Did that happen anywhere else, or is that the only case?
Excellent question. One thing that scientists are trying to work out is exactly like where it got mixed. They currently think that if someone is pure African, they wouldn't have the Neanderthal because they were in like European region, but at this point they don't have an exact notion, because it depends on like how far Neanderthals went and how far Homo sapiens went. And apparently they found like a third species that's also intermixed with Neanderthals and modern Homo sapiens. And so there could other be stuff other than there. So a lot depends on the geographical reason where one ancestors came from and what other DNA we find. I mean, it may turn out really weird. Or maybe kind of like a Lord of the Rings thing where there are all kinds of species and everybody's all kind of mixed together. Boy, would the races take that. They're like, what, I'm half Hobbit? Come on. Yeah, I think the current science is, it was, I think, mostly in the European region. But you'd want to check with like an actual science. I'm just going to what I heard on read in Scientific American. So appeal to intuition and the story. Now, the better you are at doing stories, the better it goes. I mean, again, these are methods that are going to be, I guess, to be clear, you're not required to use them, so you don't have to like, okay, I got to do an analogy, I got to do intuition. But there are ones that are useful, especially in metaphysics. And when we talk about the paper, we'll talk more about like whatever arguments you could use, because there are many that don't have like their own type of name. They're just like arguing, where you give evidence for your point. Now we get into some actual philosophers, beginning with like the dead guys. Now metaphysics, in the Western sense, goes back to when people are wondering like, what is the nature of reality? And we have the best records for the Greeks, because they like wrote a lot of stuff down, and we were lucky enough to have some of it survive. Now, lots were lost. There could have been, I'm sure there's a ton, you've probably heard of the Library of Alexandria, which was burned. Who knows how much was lost in there. So Most of what we have is what just happened to survive. So, important thing to note is that what we know is what we happen to have, which is clearly not, just tiny fragments. And for some of these people, we just have just a sentence or two at most, or references from other people. To use an analogy, it's kind of like what happened in Brazil, with the museum burned down, and museums have been burning down for thousands of years, so we have lost so much stuff. Which is why I guess digital is good. But of course that's kind of a problem too, because if you can't read the files, then it's useless. Best thing is just stone engraved, and really, because stone engraved in stone, it lasts. And you can see and you can read it.
Unless you pour water on it.
Yeah, too much water. Because we can still read like the walls of Egyptian tombs. We can still read those thousands of years. But I have floppy disks from grad school. I can't read those anymore. they're only thousands of years old too. Ancient Egyptian floppy disks from my time in grad school. Now, the pre-Socratics go back to the beginning of Western philosophy. And as far as we think, the first philosopher and scientist we know about is our good dead friend Thales. 624 to 544 BC. He was a guy, did some stuff, and you may wonder, like, how or why is he considered the first philosopher? Well, his claim to fame is this. He took mathematics, and the Egyptians did a really good job developing geometry and mathematics, very practical reasons, because when the Nile flooded, you had to figure out who owned what, and it's, geometry. And the Babylonians were really good in this, celestial observations, mostly for religious purposes, but they recorded a lot of data. So you take math, you take celestial observations, and Pythagoras combined them, and hit on the idea that if you take observations in math, then you could make predictions. And he predicted a solar eclipse. We had one happen recently. The sun is blocked by the moon. And on a particular day, which it seemed to have been created by Hollywood because there was a huge battle going on, and the Greeks fighting, I guess, other Greeks or somebody, and the moon moves in front of the sun from our perspective, it goes dark, people panic, and think the gods are angry and run off. Except, of course, Thales. Thales, I knew it really happened. Because he knew that the sun moved in front of the moon moved in front of the sun. And that was the start, at least, of recorded science and philosophy, using mathematics and data to predict stuff.
What was mathematics and data used to predict? What was that word?
Oh, mathematics and data used to predict stuff? In a way, which is science is basically using reason plus observations to predict what's going to happen. I mean, there's a lot more science than that, but that's kind of the basics of it. So what did Thales contribute to philosophy? Well, two of the big problems that are still vexing us to this day. First is the problem of the one and the many. What philosophy and science is looking for is the one thing, the one principle, the basic stuff that accounts for everything. Now, one question, of course, is the theory of everything. And physicists are working on, they have lots of versions of this. There's the grand unified theory, GUTS, total unified theory, TUTS. There's no big unified theory for obvious reasons. I guess that'd be kind of funny. And other ones, you can think of worse combinations of things. But the idea is, on one hand, have a theory that explains it all. The other big question is, metaphysical and physically, what makes up everything? If you had a metaphorical blade, sword that could cut anything until there was something uncuttable, what would be the most basic thing? Is there a point when you just, even the perfect, sword that can cut anything could not cut it anymore because there couldn't be anything small, the most basic thing. Now, of course, in physics, they're trying to figure this out. That's why they have those particle accelerators, because the idea is if you want to find out what stuff's made of, you do what every 4-year-old knows. You know what every dog knows. You start breaking stuff. You just keep breaking it until you figure out what's in there. And if you can find something that's unbreakable, you found the stuff that makes up everything. You found the basic stuff. That, you know, once you get down to the unbreakable thing or things, that's what it's all made of. Now, Thales said, if you're wondering, like, you know, about the little water drops, the theme is, of course, you know, water. Thales said, reality is water. Which today we may think kind of odd, but he had good reasons. Why? Well, if you don't have water, you die. If you dig in the ground, you find water. When water evaporates, before we had microscopes, we didn't know there was stuff in it. Water evaporates, it leaves behind a residue. And so, and of course there's rain, etc. So it seemed to make sense. He was doing empirical science. And so for him, the one thing that everything is made of is water. And that's the beginning of modern, you know, science. I mean, today, scientists, you know, we know water is, you know, 2 hydrogens and an oxygen combined together, but it's a good start. You gotta begin somewhere.
How do you spell his name?
Oh, well here, Thales, Thales. Cool name, Thales. Now, a second problem we brought about was a problem of permanence and change. Namely, what causes the one to become the many? Another part of the problem of permanence and change is this. One thing, and we'll see with the Greek philosophers really into this problem, is in order to have change, you gotta have some things not change, because otherwise you have destruction. So something's gotta remain constant. As we'll see, some philosophers, namely Parmenides, said there is no change, it's an illusion. And Heraclitus, another philosopher, said everything is changed, there is no permanence. And one part of the problem is figuring out, you know, how does water change into everything else? Because you have stuff that, you know, you got obvious water, you know, water, but then you have stuff that doesn't seem to be water. And for Thales, you know, from Thales' view, this is all water. And so the question is, how is this water different from that?
Is he also saying, I get what you just said, is he also could be saying that, like, everything in existence could come from water because the things that create things which are people, or the people which have to survive off of liquids which are water, therefore everything has been created off of water, because for this to happen from the creation, water had to be possible for it to be done.
Yeah, I mean, it's part of his argument. Yeah, we die without water. So it seems, you know.
Even though obviously this desk isn't made out of water, but I mean.
Yeah, because he'd say the desk is water, but it's a, you know, his critics say, yeah, that's not water. But he would say it's water, it's just different water.
I kind of like that theory, especially then, like when you take what Q was saying about how like the body needs it. When you look at like theories like those, because they're so old and permanent, like that's before like the microscope and everything came. So I'm saying is water, he could have observed something that in his verbiage calls water, but he probably could have been hydrogen. Because like that's like, isn't that like the central like molecule that's in all things is hydrogen or something like that? Yeah,
it's the most common. Yeah, I think hydrogen is the most common.
So like I remember hearing that theory, like he said that it was water. I thought, well, maybe Buddy just, you know, he wanted to say hydrogen, he just didn't have the verbiage for that back then. And then because like I can see that, I can see how you can observe everything in the wetness, the solidity of it, the gaseousness of it. Depending on how far it is from a particular, you could say, like, yeah, and it goes back to that. I'll just say how that.
Yeah, because, yeah, as you point out, water is made up of, everything is made up of these basic stuff, so he just didn't, you said he didn't have the words for it, he didn't have, you know, like a, you know, particle collider and stuff. So, yeah, but given what he had to work with, you know, makes sense.
at this time, was it a common acceptance that ice was water?
Yeah, yeah, so he could, another good point, because he also knows that water can change shape, form. It's one of the few, actually it's the only rock that can be, liquid that you can hold. Because we're actually, when you think of it, this is, in a way, it's kind of cool that you have basically magma. We're drinking molten rock, because ice is a rock, and so it's the only rock that's liquid at room temperature, and we can safely drink. Yeah, and also it can become a gas as well. You can do the same thing to other rocks. It's just you don't want to drink it.
Yeah.
The next time we'll pick up with the one of many and more really good things. So good weekend. See you on the one.
Yes, the last one, just bring about